The reality is that no Great Society program has ever come close to matching the reduction in black poverty that we saw prior to the Great Society. No Great Society program has ever come close to matching what blacks were doing on their own before the government decided to step in and help. The notion that black people must help themselves is not based on some right-wing Koch brother extremist ideology. It's based on the black experience in America. There is no substitute for a group's self-development. Government programs cannot save us, and an over-dependence on them can do us great harm. That is the lesson of the Great Society programs. Racial preferences are another example of a program that gets more credit than it deserves. In this case, credit for increasing the size of the black middle class, but not so fast. Between 1930 and 1970, the percentage of black white-collar workers in this country quadrupled. That's before affirmative action policies were implemented. That's during a period when you could put a sign in your window that said, "We don't hire black people." Yet in the face of these obstacles, blacks were entering the skilled professions at unprecedented rates. Yes, blacks continued to enter the white-collar professions in the wake of racial preferences. But again, this simply continued an existing trend. There was a substantial black middle class already in existence by the end of the 1960s. It has continued to grow, but again, at a slower rate than it was growing before. And as with black poverty reduction, no affirmative action program has ever come close to matching what blacks were doing on their own prior to the implementation of these programs. Moreover, racial preferences have not helped the poor, as the proponents promised. Instead, they have worked mostly to help already well-off blacks become better off. There have been case studies of Atlanta, for example, in the 1970s and 80s, where under black mayors like Maynard Jackson and Andrew Young, the city implemented racial preference policies for hiring black city workers and black contractors. What happened? Well, the number of successful black businesses increased rapidly. But average income blacks were left behind, and the black poor lost ground. And that's been the story of the black poor not only in Atlanta, but nationwide. In the era of affirmative action, the black underclass has lost ground, both in absolute terms and relative to the white underclass. In the 1970s and 80s, and even into the 90s, the first full decades of affirmative action policies, the poorest 20% of blacks saw their incomes decline at more than double the rate of comparable whites. Again, the empirical data shows that in an era of racial preferences and quotas and set-asides put in place to help the black poor, that subset has regressed. Affirmative action in higher education was also supposed to increase the ranks of black professionals. But after California banned racial preferences in college admissions, what happened? Black graduation rates rose. Instead of being funneled into schools where they were overmatched, but admitted anyway, for diversity reasons, black students started doing what white students and Asian students do. They attended schools that better matched their skill level, and the result is that more graduated. A lot more. Black graduation rates at the University of California system increased by more than 50% after racial preferences ended, including in the more difficult fields of science and math and engineering. In other words, racial preferences, which were sold as a way to increase the size of the black middle class, had resulted in fewer black doctors, fewer black lawyers and architects and physicists than we otherwise would have had in the absence of these policies. These policies are not only not helping, they are harming. But I would also argue that there's a large cultural component to the racial disparities that we see today, whether we're talking about employment, education, incarceration rates, incomes, or other measures. Yet it has become almost taboo to talk about black cultural problems. I've often told the story about a trip back home to Buffalo, New York, more than 20 years ago. I was visiting my older sister shortly after I'd begun working at the Wall Street Journal, and I was chatting with her daughter, my niece, who was maybe in the second grade at the time. I was asking her about school and her favorite subjects and that sort of thing, when she stopped me and said, "Uncle Jason, why you talk white?" She turned to her little friend next to her and said, "Don't my uncle sound white? Why are you trying to sound so smart?" And she was just teasing, of course, and I smiled and they shared a little laugh at my expense, but what she said stayed with me. I couldn't help thinking here were two young black girls, 7 or 8 years old, already linking speech patterns to race and intelligence. They already had a rather sophisticated awareness that as blacks, white-sounding speech was not only to be avoided in their own speech, but mocked in the speech of other blacks. Now, I shouldn't have been too surprised by this, and I wasn't. My siblings, along with countless other black friends and relatives, teased me the same way when I was growing up. And other black professionals, from President Obama and Mrs. Obama on down, have told similar stories. What I had forgotten is just how early these attitudes take hold, how soon this counterproductive thinking and behavior begins. In New York City, where I'm based, we have the largest school system in America, and 80% of black kids in New York City public schools are performing below grade level. 80%. And a big part of the problem is a black subculture that rejects attitudes and behaviors that are conducive to academic success. Black kids read half as many books and watch twice as much television as their white counterparts, for example. In other words, a big part of the problem is a culture that produces little black girls and boys who are already worried about acting and sounding white by the time they are in the second grade. Another big part of the problem is a reluctance to speak honestly about these cultural shortcomings. Many whites fear being called racist, and many black leaders have a vested interest in blaming black problems primarily on white racism. So that is the narrative they push, regardless of the reality. Racism has become an all-purpose explanation for bad black outcomes, be they social or economic. If you disagree and are white, you are a bigot. If you disagree and are black, you're a sellout. Too often, this is the level of discourse, schoolyard name-calling. Even President Obama has been subjected to this treatment when he broaches the topic of black cultural shortcomings. On several occasions, he has spoken to black audiences about absent fathers. When he spoke at Morehouse a couple years ago, he said, quote, "I was raised by a heroic single mother and wonderful grandparents who made incredible sacrifices for me. But I still wish I had a father who was not only present but involved. And so my whole life, I've tried to be for Michelle and my girls what my father wasn't for my mother and me. I've tried to be a better father, a better husband, a better man." Obama told those black men in the audience to be good role models for other, less fortunate black men. He said, "The brothers who have been left behind, who haven't had the same opportunities we have, they need to hear from us. We need to be in the barbershops with them, at church with them, helping pull them up, exposing them to new opportunities. We have to teach them what it means to be a man." Now that might sound like common sense to you and me. And I'm sure there are some people in this room who wish this was all Obama would talk about all the time. But Obama gets slammed by liberals in general and black liberals in particular when he says these sorts of things, because he's seen as criticizing black culture, condescending to blacks, being an elitist. Most significantly, he's accused of letting whites off the hook, which is a big no-no on the black left. But the facts are on the president's side. For decades, studies have shown that the likelihood of teen pregnancy, drug abuse, dropping out of school, and many other bad social outcomes increased dramatically when fathers were not around. One of the most comprehensive studies ever done about this concluded that black boys without a father were 68% more likely to be incarcerated than those with a father. The study said that overall the most critical factor affecting the prospect that a male youth will encounter the criminal justice system is the presence of a father in the home. All other factors, including family income, are much less important, according to this research. One social scientist put it this way: if crime is to a significant degree caused by weak character, if weak character is more likely among children of unmarried mothers, if there are no fathers who will help raise their children, acquire jobs, protect their neighborhoods, if boys become young men with no preparation for work, if school achievement is regarded as a sign of having sold out, if all these things are true, then the chances of reducing the crime rate among low-income blacks anytime soon is slim. Folks, this is Baltimore. This is the Bronx. This is St. Louis. This is Chicago and Detroit. But you're not supposed to say that. It's politically incorrect. Try to bring up black culture in a debate over criminal behavior today. You will have your head handed to you. Try to bring up the breakdown of the black family in a debate about crime. In fact, we don't even talk about black crime anymore. We talk about black incarceration rates, as if the two are completely unrelated. We talk about police shootings of young black men as a measure of whether America values black lives or whether cops value black lives. We've had mobs of people all over the country pretending that there is an epidemic of cops shooting blacks. And the media has played right along. This is nonsense. Police are involved in approximately 2% of black shooting deaths in this country each year. In fact, a cop is 6 times as likely to be shot by someone black than the opposite scenario. In March of this year, 4 cops were killed over a 7-day period. All of them were black. How many of you were aware of that? Do you know their names? Where was the wall-to-wall media coverage? Where were the outraged protesters? Where were the civil rights leaders? Where was the White House press conference? Do those black lives matter? Blacks are about 13% of the population in this country, but commit more than half of all murders. And 90% of their victims are other blacks. The question isn't whether cops value black lives or America values black lives. Isn't the more relevant question whether the young black men doing all this killing value black lives? Are we supposed to hold whites to a higher standard than blacks hold each other? I think a previous generation of civil rights leaders would have laughed at that notion. Homicide is the leading cause of death for young black men in the U.S., and it is not because cops are shooting them. Bad cops should be punished to the full extent of the law. And law enforcement should certainly be held to a high standard for violating the public trust. But if you believe that black lives matter, if you want to reduce the black body count, as a practical matter, should your focus be on the 2% of black shooting deaths that involve cops or the 98% that don't? Let me close by noting that this concept of self-help and self-development that I think is essential to black advancement is something that black leaders once understood all too well. And at a time in this country when blacks faced infinitely more obstacles than they face today. Frederick Douglass said in 1865 that everybody had asked him and the other abolitionists what to do with the Negro. He said, "I've had but one answer from the beginning: do nothing with us. If the apples will not remain on the tree of their own strength, let them fall. And if the Negro cannot stand on his own legs, let him fall also. All I ask is give him a chance to stand on his own legs." Douglass was essentially saying, give blacks equal opportunity and then leave us alone. Booker T. Washington echoed that sentiment. He said that it is important and right that all privileges of the law be ours. But it is vastly more important, he said, that we be prepared for the exercise of those privileges. Douglas and Washington didn't play down the need for the government to secure equal rights for blacks. And both were optimistic that blacks would get equal rights eventually, although neither man lived to see that day. But both men understood the limits of government benevolence. Blacks would have to ready themselves to meet the far bigger challenge of being in a position to take advantage of opportunities once equal rights had been secured. Dr. King also understood this. He once told a black congregation, "Do you know that Negroes are 10% of the population in St. Louis and responsible for 58% of the crimes?" He said, "We've got to face that. We've got to do something about our moral standards." He said, "We know that there are many things wrong in the white world, but there are many things wrong in the black world too. We can't keep on blaming the white man. There are things we must do for ourselves." Now, I used those statements from King in a column I wrote for the Wall Street Journal a couple of years ago. And some readers accused me of making up the quotes, which come from a profile of King in Harper's Magazine in 1961. And I was a little taken aback by the accusation, because the article can be located on Google without too much trouble. But what really struck me about the accusation is that those making it just couldn't believe that the nation's most prominent civil rights leaders used to speak this way about problems in the black community and the role of personal responsibility. It's a completely foreign concept to them, which might tell you everything you need to know about what passes for black leadership today. On that happy note, I will stop and take questions if you have them. Are there any? Or you want to?
Yeah, I'll just let it cover this. Okay. We do have an afternoon program today, so we will be downstairs at some point, because I feel like as we open this up to questions, everybody in the room may have some. So we will take some questions, and I will give this other piece over to my right. Your left are his books. Please stop helping us. If you want more of Jason Riley, you can grab one of those books. He's going to actually take some time after this and do a little bit of book signing if you'd like it signed. But prior to, we'll take a few questions, and I don't know, that was pretty heavy. Go ahead, sir. Anyone first? Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Jason, yesterday the Ferguson Commission released their report on what went wrong in Ferguson, Missouri, and how to fix it. The general consensus was the police need to be better trained. The police need to use minimum force. The police need to stop profiling. And there needs to be an expansion of nutritional programs, housing programs, an expansion of Medicaid, and a few other programs to solve the problem. What's your take on that?
Well, I think we see a pattern here when we have these occurrences, whether it's Ferguson, whether it's Baltimore, they trigger a conversation, but I think it's the wrong conversation. The tension between law enforcement and these communities, I believe, is rooted in black crime rates. It's rooted in black behavior. Until those crime rates go down, you are going to have tension between the police and these communities. That's just, I think, the reality. So we get into this, do black people trust the cops? I love these polls that come out. Black people don't trust the cops. Black people call the cops more than anybody else in America. That is a funny way of showing you don't trust the police. But the more serious point is that the cops are in these neighborhoods because that's when the 9/11 calls originate. that's the bottom line. And so I think until we address the criminality going on in these neighborhoods, these tensions are going to continue. But we don't want to talk about that. We want to talk about we want to talk about poverty. We want to talk about unemployment. Black crime rates were lower in the 1940s and 50s and early 60s than they are today. Was there less racism in that period of U.S. history? Black poverty was much higher in the black community in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, yet black crime rates were much lower. So again, we want to draw these comparisons and blame it on poverty, blame it on joblessness and so forth. I just don't buy it. The black community had, you can go back and look at census data in the 1920s and 30s where you saw black labor participation rates in some years exceeding those of whites. Again, when you could put a sign in your window that said, we won't hire blacks, you had labor participation rates much higher than you have today, and much closer to more racial parity between blacks and whites. So,
Bishop Stewart.
Jason, most black pastors know this, but they are absolutely afraid to talk about it. I have started teaching on the family recently because one of my proteges over there, Pastor Davis, we had a conversation, and I've been doing some series. You have to dress it up so much, like putting a ribbon on a pig, in order for the people to accept it. Our people do not want to accept these facts. It's too painful. It's absolutely too painful. And so the pastor has to use the wisdom of God to even make any references to him in order for him to keep his congregation. I've been pastoring this church for 30 years. And a lot of my people who love me, they cannot handle it. It's so painful. And so I've been preaching a long time, and I'm going to preach the message, but I'm telling you, I have to use more wisdom than Solomon used in order to put it out there so my people will keep coming to church. It's so painful. And that's the absolute truth.
Well, but the other factors, I think,
shouldn't do it.
Right.
I'm saying you better have a lot of wisdom to be able to do it if you want to hold a congregation.
I think one of the other factors working against you is the narrative out there pushed by the left in terms of, whites are about alleviating their own guilt over this history, this ugly history of racism in America. So they don't want to believe that any of these problems that blacks face today are directly result from the behavior of blacks today. They don't want to believe that. The second thing I think you have working against you, though, is that the civil rights movement has become a civil rights industry. It is a very lucrative to spin the narrative that you're Jesse Jackson and you're Al Sharpton. You stand up and you say the things I say. Star Parker invites you to come speak. You say the things Al Sharpton says. You get your own TV show. I mean, there's an industry out there that rewards a certain narrative, and a lot of today's black leadership is cashing in, and I think that is the other problem you have to deal with when trying to get another narrative out there.